Thank you, Cindy. Thank you all. I think the council will probably have some questions. I'd like to lead off, though. Ellen, you offered up a strategy of polling each of the state and federal agencies to give a list of the issues, projects, plans that they have that would further help to implement the Delta plan. And that would be a pretty big universe of ideas and issues and actions. Cindy, you offered the suggestion that the implementation committee needs to limit the number of issues and to focus that. Maybe the two of you could discuss among yourselves for our benefit how to sync those two ideas, because I think they're both good and I think they're both valuable. How do we make that happen?
I don't know. I'm not sure they're mutually compatible ways to think about this. And so water transfers is a topic I happen to know a fair amount about, and I agree that that's something where we need to look at how to improve it, but to me, it's that would be an example of something that is inhibited now by things that go well beyond the issues of coordinating on water transfers, and they really relate to broader ecosystem management strategies and goals. So I would see that as a kind of, that would to me be a kind of a working group kind of task, and I would see the sort of, I agree about having the agency heads show up, and it would be nice to have them also engage on something as specific as water transfers, but I feel like at this point what would be most helpful is having the broad strategic planning efforts that the various agencies have for what they are going to be doing, either from a regulatory perspective, if that's their nature, or from a management perspective, if that's their nature, so that one can have a way to sort of see how those fit together across the agencies, and then tackle something like transfers. Maybe one of the sort of issues that rises to the top is something that needs some special tackling as well. There'll be others too, I'm sure. That would be my thought.
Okay. Thanks. Cindy?
Well, Alan and I often find that we can agree on things. We have a favorite restaurant, or a restaurant that we both like, in the middle of Illinois, where I'm from. I think it is important for the implementation committee to have the strategic vision and have discussions on the bigger strategy. There's no question on that, but they shouldn't just focus on that and get lost and not deliver any results. If we can combine that strategic look with some specific deliverables, I think that helps the Delta and the state of California.
Okay.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just as I was formerly the CalFed federal agency coordinator for CalFed, so it was my job to keep all the federal agencies kind of going in the same direction at least.
Hit your red button.
There we go.
There we go.
So the only thing I'd add, actually, you made some good points, is we always had a challenge of, do we do these public, do we do these private? We got more done, frankly, when they were agencies working together in private. But the key role for the council, I see, is setting the agenda. And it's a little bit about what each of you said about what kind of things they're doing. So you can do, when you bring it, and it's important to bring the highest level you can. I mean, we got the most attention when Bruce Babbitt was there, or when Bruce Babbitt was driving things on the federal side. But, so having high level is important, but your choice of what they're talking about is going to be important. And there are times where it's necessary, at a lower level, there's conflict. And when you can set the agenda to help those agencies resolve their conflicts, that interagency conflict, that may be the most important thing you do, is setting the agenda.
Other council questions? Comments?
The last panel, when asked what the role and authority of the council was, I guess the unanimous impression was that the council was a convener without authority or oversight without correction. And I was comforted by the comments of Chris Stevens, who made a somewhat different interpretation of our authority, and I guess I'm looking for a little more love here. I mean, can you each tell me in a nutshell, if that's possible, what the role of the council is and what really our authority is? And maybe that might be a little too, given what Alf has described, and maybe that might be possible, but if you can, starting with you, Alf, could you make that?
Sure.
Give us your perception.
Yes, and I'd say, we set this out. We set that challenge for you of doing this implementation committee, and keeping in mind what had happened with CalFed and what had happened with the Bay Delta Authority. But the piece is, it goes back to the planning piece. In other words, you can do things coming out of those meetings to say, well, that's not really, give guidance, that's not really consistent with the plan. Or if it needs clarification, you can go back and deal with the plan to say, that's not really part of the plan. You can do that explicitly. So that's the authority you have. It may not be in those meetings. It may be convening, but you have a lot of influence. And the authority you have, it goes back, in my view, to your ability to change the plan and respond to how things are going.
So, with respect to the discussion in the earlier panel, it's our sense that there is some ambiguity in the language about exactly whether or not, if you for covered actions that for which you do have the enforcement authority, if you find something inconsistent, whether or not that action can go ahead subject to resolution in the courts, or whether that action just can't go forward. And certainly the council has articulated well, and I'm speaking really, I hope I'm articulating well, channeling my two law scholar colleagues, because I'm not a lawyer, but the council has certainly articulated a view that, as Chris Stevens mentioned, I'm guessing you also anticipate that you're going to have to try this out in the courtroom. But our sense was, and our in looking at what else the council can do besides that sort of particular purview over local covered actions and state non-regulatory actions within the Delta. I guess is our sense that there's potential for a lot of moral authority by virtue of being the integrative expert agency on the Delta with a charge which is to be broader in thinking about the co-equal goals, and it's not by chance that BDCP is going to be, if it is successful in its goals, will be a piece of the plan and not the plan. It's ambitious in scope, but it's looking at a narrower set of objectives and stressors, frankly, too. So that's helpful.
Feeling the love? No.
And I would just add, and I think, the council knows this a lot better than I do, but, in the law, it clearly lays out the consistency process, the consistency determinations, and if the council finds that the covered action, what the agency does, isn't consistent with the plan, then it goes back to the agency, the state or local agency, to correct that. But obviously the council plays a critical role. But I think the way the legislature worked it out, and Alf, as you were very much involved in this, sending it back to the agency for the correction. For example, if it's Water Board, they are the expert agency on water rights and water quality, and it makes sense for them to do that. But so the statute strikes a good balance with the roles of the agencies and the role of the council.
Chris, why don't you comment, if you would?
Yeah, I'll give you a little more love here. So I think the first thing with regard to statutory interpretation, as you know, I'm speaking as a student of the fine scholarship that you have imparted on the state, you look to the language first in the law. So perception is very important. Obviously, we have a huge task. The water community, Aqua, has been advocating all along that our primary role is one of coordination. And I think that everyone here agrees now and we've taken a measured approach. It's a hybrid approach. Coordination has to be first and foremost, though. I think we can all agree on that. With regard to authority, though, you take a look at the statute. The statute is clear that we were mandated to come up with a legally enforceable plan. The statute's also clear that what we do has to be consistent with federal law. Alf knows that because he just gave us some background. It actually says we have to be consistent with CZMA. CZMA is a federal body of law. As Alf said, he saw that in the legislation as the hook for potentially bringing the federal proposed actions consistent with the state plan. When you look at CZMA requires enforceability in a state plan for purposes of being approved under that federal body of law. There has to be enforceability. So our own state law is clear that the plan has to be legally enforceable. It sets up an appeals process, a consistency certification process. It also gave the council the authority to adopt appellate or rules governing procedures, and in its wisdom gave us an exemption from the Administrative Procedures Act in going through that. The council actually has adopted procedures governing appeals and has adopted a procedure directly on this point. So I admit that we still hear differing opinions on how actions will be dealt with if and when the council determines that they're inconsistent with the Delta Plan, whether or not they're just sent back to an agency to make corrections, or whether or not they are sent back to an agency to make corrections and the actions don't go forward unless those corrections are made, which in my view seems to be the logical one, because it doesn't make sense to go through the resource-intensive process of running appeals, having an august body like yours determine whether or not something is inconsistent. And if it is, sending it back to an agency that says, okay, well, here's my second certification of consistency, and it looks a lot like the first one. We've sort of addressed some of the issues, but by the way, we're implementing the action nevertheless. To me, that doesn't make sense. To me, there was a difference in the way that the legislature set this body up, again, from the Bay Delta Authority. So we look first to the statutory language. We also, admittedly, if there are areas of gray areas or areas of ambiguity, you can look to other sources. The first place that I look, having been a legislative attorney for the California State Legislature, is to the legislative analyses that accompany the bills.
Who wrote that?
Yeah, and so I'm going to give credit to Alf for having written what I consider a really good legislative analysis on the bill that became the Delta Reform Act. And I think that analysis, which will become part of our administrative record, is clear in pointing out that this is a different situation, that the legislature was clear that the Delta Plan should be the unified state plan, the unified state direction going forward, and together with the consistency review process and the appeals process is the difference to make a difference. It's what will make things happen. Without that, it would, as I think the Little Hoover Commission jokingly said about the Bay Delta Authority, it was merely a lunch club. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. In my view, you look to the statute, it's clear. You look to the legislative analyses in areas of ambiguity. I think that we do have authority. I think what Alf points to, as our other distinguished panel members point to, is the level of discretion that was given to the council to come up with the right mix. And I think that that's what you guys have been doing for the last 2.5 years. And I think that we do have the right mix. So, I'm fully aware that we may have some battles ahead, but I think that you have a product that you can be proud of and a product that is true to the statute.
And also add to what you just said, I think Alf mentioned the fact that there would be some judicial deference given to the agency, which is a pretty critical notion as well. I think you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, no, that was a part of the understanding of all that we wrote. That was the understanding. And there were various times where we were, and I tried to put it in the analysis when I could, but there were times where we said we just can't get there. Your standard of review on some things, there was a lot of debate about that, and in that case, I don't think I addressed that because it was just too hot, and we couldn't deal with what the standard of review was. So we left it to you to interpret and figure out what that was, and that's why we also gave you the exemption from the APA so that you could figure out what that standard review was. But to respond a little bit more about this was the consistency review process was a compromise. It was an important part. If we were going to comply with CZMA, we need to have some kind of enforcement ability and across consistently. Not you couldn't make exemptions for we'll take care of this entity or that entity. You need to be consistent. If you're going to do it against the feds, you need to do it against the state and local entities. What ended up, and I actually had this question recently, was you can stop things. You can't say no. You can never do that. You can't ultimately say that will never work, and so stop spending money on it. But what you can do is you can effectively stop it by, in effect, a do loop, because they can keep appealing, or they can keep coming back with a new one, and they keep appealing, and they don't ever get started. That's a possibility, but maybe. The key piece of some of the language talks about they have to prepare the certification before they proceed. So they're on hold. They prepare a new certification. So they may proceed for a while, and then within 30 days there's another appeal. And so it could just be an endless part. You're not authorized to require an agency to take an action. You can't direct them to take an action or spend money in certain ways or do those kinds of things. But if you have it as part of the plan, if they do anything related to that action, related to that what is part of the plan, then you can say you're not going to do it that way. You're not going to do that. So you do have the authorities. You have the authorities to be able to influence. I won't use the word direct because we ultimately that was part of an earlier version, but then we took that out. But you have, by your planning efforts, you have an ability to influence and shape the direction of the programs and projects. You may set a direction and say we need to be doing this. You can't tell them to do it, but if they try and do anything close to that, you can say, well, that's not consistent with what we told you it needs to get done. So you do have. So I hope I don't know whether that's love, but it is. I think you do have some critical authority.
This is great, Alp. Having you here is like studying the Constitution with James Madison. Earlier today, when we were going through the executive summary document, and Judge Damrell cited the sentence, "Its decision will be binding," and the water contractors in direct testimony and in letters. And in their comment on this executive summary, have said The use of binding implies the council can stop an activity from proceeding if it finds inconsistency with the Delta plan. This overstates the council's authority. After a project proponent responds to initial inconsistency determination, the project may still go forward as modified or as originally proposed. The Delta Reform Act did not provide the council with the power to halt projects altogether.
That last comment is probably right. Stop it altogether. But let me point to the language here that we were very specific. And if the agency decides to proceed with the action or with the action is modified to respond to the findings of the council, the agency shall, prior to proceeding with the action, file a revised certification of consistency. So they can't start moving until they file a new consistency. And so maybe for 30 days they can start moving ahead. But then there's going to be another appeal, and they're back. So the reality, the effectiveness is you can't. In effect, you can slow it down, and if they want to go through it repeatedly, you can, in the end, wear them out.
So the council was granted regulatory authority. Is that correct?
In those words, no. Because the covered actions, you were granted consistency authority to make that determination consistently with the plan. But the issue is the covered actions exclude regulatory actions. And where we were focused there was the State Water Board. We didn't want you regulating and creating your own rules for water quality.
What then would be a proper way to state what our authority is?
Your authority is to...
Yeah, on the issue on covered actions, right.
On covered actions, which excludes regulatory actions, you have the authority to redirect. Yes, you require consistency. Yeah, I think that's accurate. That's actually, I'm sorry, I haven't quite been asked this question before, so I'm kind of, but I think that require consistency, yes. You have authority to require consistency with your plan. So you have the authority to create the plan. That's a big piece. And then you have authority to require consistency, that people have to be consistent with it. Our agency, state and local agency have to be consistent. And presumably if you get CZMA approval, and federal agencies as well.
If you look at the words of the statute, it says that the council shall either deny the appeal or remand the matter to the state or local public agency. And one comment I would make is I don't think it makes good policy sense to have an infinite do loop. We need to have things function in a good way, a rational way. So we want to avoid the infinite do loop scenario.
I can't agree with you more. I think that's accurate. That is up to the agency, the action agency, as well. I mean, if they're going to really just defy and go against what is the state's plan, and they decide they want to go a different direction, then that's their choice. Then that's their choice to be in a constant do loop. So I think it really is going to be largely up to those action agencies, the choices that they make, how they respond to what the plan has. I mean, part of what we were reacting to was agencies kind of off the reservation in CalFed and saying, well, that's fine. You guys work together, but we have another plan. And that's the kind of thing we wanted to ensure that there was some sense of some common plan for the state on how the state as a whole, this is a resource of statewide and even hemispheric importance. So we needed to have a plan as a state. And it's up to the action agencies to be consistent with that plan.
Alf, did you intend in this circumstance of repetitive inconsistency determinations for the council itself or the executive officer to be able to initiate the appeal?
No. Although, I mean, you read the language, that was not what we intended. I mean, we believed that there would be, if there was questions, it was more about the questions of parties that would show up.
Yeah,
But-
and if that's an interesting point. I do want to point out, though, that we have adopted procedures governing appeals. I hate to sound like a broken record, but we were granted legislative authority to adopt those procedures, which we did after public debate, I think over the course of 3 council meetings in 2010. And the council decided that that was the course that they were going to take. So although I completely defer to Alf's better judgment and wisdom on the original intent of what the legislature may or may not have been thinking, this council then took it the next step, which I think was what the legislature intended in general with regard to implementation. And that does now have the force and effect of law.
And I think we would not disagree. I mean, look at the words that we used. And this was, our vision was any person who claims a proposed covered action. So while we may not have intended, but we just thought there are so many people out there, any person could file an appeal. And in other words, we were dealing with thoughts of standing. And by putting any person who claims that a proposed covered action is inconsistent with the Delta plan, that's wide open. That doesn't mean you have to have an interest in the piece. It was any person in the state. So conceivably, and I'll leave it to you. I don't think we're going to dispute whether you choose to have the council be one of the any persons.
Don't you move from legislative intent then to the discretion of the agency and then deference to the agency's decision? That's kind of the progress of
yes.
a judge would take.
Yes, right. And that's why I think the language, if there's any ambiguity, I believe it goes to the discretion of the agency.
Any other comments? Good, because we only have about 8 minutes left on the DVD before and it is about lunchtime. Panelists, I want to thank you, all 3 of you, for coming and sharing with us your comments about the planning aspects of moving forward. Well done, well taken. Alf, I think the history that you provide will help us to sharpen our communications message as we move on to implementation. And some of these questions you've heard, I think, are the council wrestling with how do we portray ourselves as we move forward so that we can add the maximum value to solutions in the Delta. And Ellen, your idea of surveying all the agencies and asking for a list of the things that they're doing or planning to do, and leads me to believe that we need to furnish every one of them with the 71, if that's what it ultimately is, 71 recommendations, 14 regulations, and ask them to do an evaluation of that and give us their work plan. And Cindy, your recommendation to include in the implementation committee level the highest agency representatives we can get and to keep the focus concise and the issues narrow as we begin to try and implement some things. All well taken comments. So thank you all very much for coming.
Can I just have one question?
Yes.
Just in
2 minutes.
2 minutes, fine. Thank you for all the input, but I really want to ask Alf, your interpretation, of course you wrote the law and the language, but based on what you've heard around the table, and I assume you've read the plan or the regulations or whatever, do they really reflect your interpretation of the role and the authority of the council? Should I ask
I would say they're not inconsistent.
You're going to get into a loop on that one.
We should have had you, but all respect to Chris. I mean, he's given us great legal opinion, but, I just want to kind of ask you that.
I don't see anything that violates and goes against it. So I think that's probably the key from my point of view. Because in many cases, we had to just say, we're not going to be able to resolve this one. And I tried to do it in the analysis and say how in those cases. But there are times that we just kind of stayed out of it. And I'll just say that. So I'd say there's nothing inconsistent.
So we're okay.
But, I'll leave that to your legal counsel.
Well, on that positive note, panelists, thank you. We'll break for lunch now. It's 1:05. We'll reconvene at 1:45. 1:45. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can we adjust the temperature? It's a little chilly up front.